Okay, hello everyone, and thank you so much for being with us here today. My name is Paulina Raniecka, and I am the Research and Communications Coordinator at the ASI Water Security and Justice Cluster and at the New Wave Network. We are thrilled to be launching our webinar on water security and justice, and we're so happy to see so many people connected today. Over the course of the next few months, we will be uncovering the concepts of water security and water justice through 4 thematic angles, in particular water conflicts, water scarcity, water for nexus, and water mining nexus. We are honored to begin with today's lecture on the topic of water conflicts applying the lens of water justice, delivered by Professor Jan Selby. The lecture will last 45 minutes and will be followed by a 15-minute Q&A. We kindly ask you to use the Q&A chat button at the very top of your screen to write your questions there. I will now pass it to Dr. Gianpel Del Angelo, lead of New Wave and of our ASI cluster, for the introduction of Professor Jan Selby. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulina. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. Thank you, Jan. Jan Selby is a professor of international politics and climate at the University of Leeds. His research focuses on the political causes and responses to climate and other environmental changes. But he has also worked on themes in international relations, theory, conflict, peace building and development, and Middle East politics. A sociologist by training, his work is informed by a combination of political ecology, historical materialism, and post-colonial international relations. He's an extremely prolific author. There are so many papers that I constantly recommend to my students and colleagues. Some of my favorites, are Oil and Water, the Contrasting Anatomies of Resource Conflicts. He made very strong contributions to the Israeli-Palestinian water dynamics with a number of important papers published in peer-reviewed journals on the issue. And particularly important, in my opinion, is his criticism of the positivist climate conflict research. Strongly recommended his paper in Geopolitics and his book, Rethinking Climate Change, Conflict and Security. Recently, he has published with Cambridge University Press the book Divided Environments, an International Political Ecology of Climate Change, Water and Security. And without further ado, thank you very much, Jan. I would like to invite you to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Gianpel, and thanks, Gianpel and Paulina, for this invitation and for setting up this event and this whole series. It's an honor to be able to kick the series off with this lecture, and thanks everybody for giving up your time. It's much appreciated. So the questions which sort of lie behind and motivate this lecture are quite simple. What is water security? And what is water justice? Or looked at the other way around as well, what are water insecurity and water injustice? They're the motivating questions behind this lecture. And I asked them because over the last 15 years or so, large bodies of research and expertise have developed on both of these themes. But the water security and water justice literatures, they've developed very different characters, and they've mostly run in parallel without a lot of dialogue between them. And that is, to my mind, a problem. So what I want to do today is to suggest briefly why this is a problem, before then outlining how I think we should understand water security and water justice together. And then in the main body of the lecture, providing some substantive illustrations of what this might mean. I'm not going to offer definitions or particularly precise definitions of exactly how these two terms should be defined and understood. But what I'm trying to offer today is a set of suggestions about what to do with them and what to do with them together. Now, the examples that I'll provide and that I'll draw on today They're all drawn from my 2022 book, which Jean-Paul mentioned, Divided Environments, which is, I must mention, my co-authors, is co-authored with Gabrielle Daoust and Clemens Hoffmann. And this book explores climate, water, security issues, the nexus between them, and it explores it empirically through analysis of 5 conflict-plagued and partitioned spaces: Cyprus, Israel-Palestine, Sudan, Syria, and on a slightly different scale, the Lake Chad Basin. I'm not going to say a great deal about each of those cases. The book dips in and out of them in turn. It doesn't offer it offers more a thematic analysis, which dips in and out of the cases. And I guess I'm going to do something similar to that today. I'm going to draw upon evidence from those relating to those cases to comment on what I see as 3 crucial water security issues: the global virtual water trade, what we call water frontiers, and the impacts of war on water resources, water supply, etc. So I'm going to do conceptual stuff, and then I'm going to dip into these 3 water security issues, and then I'm going to provide a slightly more detailed illustration by focusing on a case that I just have to talk about at the moment, which is Gaza. The conceptual argument that I'm making today, I should say, it's not explicitly made in the book. It's the first time I'm making it here, but I think it's probably implicit within the book, and the empirical material is mostly from the book, some of it slightly developed. I should also say that chapter 6 of the book is available on the New Wave website as an accompaniment to this lecture. That's the chapter of the book which is on frontiers. So the material, the brief comments I'll make here on frontiers, they're developed in much more detail in that chapter. Let me start by mapping some of the key differences between the existing water security and water justice literatures as I understand them. Now, there are, of course, always fine-grained differences for individual works and so on, which are to some extent obscured by an overall mapping. And I realize that's what I'm doing here. But here's how I would characterize the overall and main differences between the 2 approaches. They have different understandings along the different types of criteria that you see down there on the left, and I'll just run through them quite briefly. The literature on water security. So firstly, problem. What problem? How do these literatures define the central problem that they're trying to engage with and understand? The water security literature typically stresses that there are a diversity of different dimensions of water security. Questions of availability, of quality, of vulnerability to water-related disasters, water needs or water use for different purposes, for instance, for basic needs, for food security, to support socio-economic development, for ecosystem health. So a diversity of substantive issues recognized within that literature. Now, this is within the water justice literature slightly differently. This is typically accepted. It's pretty straightforward, really, that, and I think pretty incontrovertible, that there are a diversity of substantive issues when one's thinking about either water security or water justice. But the water justice literature and research tends to emphasize, and its really central plank of its emphasis, is that regardless of which of these issues one is considering or one is analysing, one needs to analyse them through the lens of politics and power to understand water justice issues, as this literature frames them, as functions of politics and power. In terms of method, what do we find? Well, we find within the water security literature, typically has quite a descriptive quality in terms of method, draws heavily upon quantifications of degrees of water security or insecurity, and develops indicators of the extent and depth of water security along whichever dimensions are being studied. The water justice literature typically goes for something slightly different. It has more explanatory rather than simply descriptive aims. which typically involves quite a qualitative, contextual form of analysis that tries to understand those descriptive patterns within a political and social context. Spatial ontology. What do I mean by this? Well, what I mean by this is how these two literatures, how do they understand how the scales or the spaces at which these patterns play out. Now, there's a lot of different answers to this, and this is I'm clearly generalizing here, but the dominant tendency within the water security literature is to understand these patterns, especially the quantitative patterns that I just mentioned, at a national scale, and to compare them across and between national scales. So one gets graphics like this, for instance, which comes from United Nations University's 2023 Global Water Security Assessment, which maps degrees of water security on a country-by-country basis and compares them on a scale from 1 to 100. Within the water justice literature, by contrast, one tends to have a different scale and a scalar sort of pattern and logic which is at work. There's much more emphasis upon local forms of water injustice, or one could say insecurity, often understood, typically understood, and in a sort of multi-scalar way in relation to national and especially global contexts, and operating then with a quite relational ontology, which doesn't focus on particular places as having sort of discrete problems, but that those problems are always embedded within broader scales. In terms of prescription, again, we find a difference, and this follows, hopefully you can see it follows reasonably logically from the sort of the things that I've already been talking about. Within the water security literature, one typically gets prescriptions which are around, which vary from publication to publication, but focus on technical measures, increasing wastewater reuse, improving irrigation efficiency, and so on, typically framed in quite technical and apolitical ways, even when political things are being discussed. The water justice literature tends to present these its prescriptions quite differently, tends to prescribe to understand what's needed and depict what's needed in much more political terms, with a focus in particular, often drawing upon the sort of frameworks developed that go back to work by Nancy Fraser on questions of redistribution, so the distribution of goods and bads and the potential for redistribution of those, and questions of recognition and participation of groups within political processes, because politics is everywhere from this sort of perspective in relation to water. And then finally, what type of discipline do we see, or disciplinary approach do we see at work in these different approaches? Well, typically, I mean, the water security work tends to bring insights and different types of indicators and emphases from lots of different disciplinary perspectives. So I think it's impossible to say there's a particular discipline which dominates or informs water security research. Water justice research is much more associated with a particular type of approach, however, that approach being political ecology, about which I'll say a little bit more in a moment. So that's my overall mapping of some of the key differences between these two literatures as they've developed. How do I respond to that? So the first thing, a number of points here, and then I'll have one further slide on this conceptual stuff. I mean, the first overall thing I want to say here is that really I think what we see here are two different types of approach to understanding the same set of problems. We shouldn't think that there are water security problems and then there are water justice problems, which are the more political ones. So there are different approaches and different languages, different premises, different prescriptions to what we should broadly understand as the same type of set of problems. Now, my own preferences, my own inclinations are much more towards the emphases of water justice researchers. It seems to me, though I would of course be happy to have discussions about this, it seems to me pretty self-evident that if one wants to understand the causes and roots of water problems, one can't stay at simply at a technical level. One needs to embed those in a broader socio-political understanding, and to understand that water politics is, in a sense, everywhere. Now, saying that doesn't mean that the technical questions don't matter at all and don't make any difference. Politics often much politics unfolds through and with the aid of technical measures, processes, instruments, infrastructures, and so on and so forth. Fundamentally, I would advocate a very sort of what I would think of as a very techno-political reading of these things. But I absolutely agree with Farhana Sultana when she says in her essay on water justice that water is essentially about power. The power to decide, control, allocate, manage, thereby affecting people's lives. This is intersectionally experienced by gender, class, race, and other axes of social difference, therefore affecting different groups of people in varied ways. It's a classic statement here of a sort of a water justice perspective, and personally, I'm very much on with her on that. What I want to say, though, is that I find the existence of these somewhat separate tracks of water security and water justice research to be a bit of a problem. I think it's a problem because it lets water security research, in particular, off the hook too much. And to some extent, it seems to me that the development of the separate track of sort of water justice research and thinking has allowed, to a certain extent, water security framings and thinking to continue being to going their sort of rather technical and apolitical way. So what I would advocate in light of that broadly is that water justice researchers need to engage with, reclaim and repoliticize the language of water security. That, if you like, is the overall most important central conceptual argument I'd want to make here. I also think, though, that there are opportunities for mutual learning. I think there are things probably that water justice researchers can learn from the water security literature and debates. And crucially, I think there are important issues which are underexplored across both approaches. And I'm going to comment on some of those in a few minutes. Let me come on to say something more, a little bit more about the type of approach that I would advocate. Firstly, how do I think that we should understand security and water security? Sorry, I'm just having to put my phone down. My daughter decided to ring me right now, even though she said that she's meant to be keeping quiet. These things happen. I might get interrupted by my kids in a few moments as they come home. I would advocate, first of all, a materialist understanding of security, insecurity, and in turn, water security and insecurity. What do I mean by that, and what's at stake in this? Well, it seems to me that security is often used in a number of different ways, which I find problematic. One is simply as a buzzword that doesn't mean very much. The second is essentially linked to the state or to the military, which is one of the reasons that I think people working on water justice often hide away from the concept of security. And then within much sort of constructivist critical security studies, it's analysed as a speech act. To talk about security is to do something performatively at the level of utterance, calling forth exceptional measures and calling forth militarized solutions and so on. I think we should try to think about security and in turn water security slightly differently from that. I understand insecurity I think we need to start by thinking about what's insecurity and insecurity in relation to water. I would define that simply as insecurity as a condition of suffering experienced or faced by individuals or collectivities, and water security, insecurity following from that. Security as on one level, the reverse of that, the condition of relative freedom from such experiences or threats. But also, and at the same time, I think we really need to recognize that actions taken to increase security can simultaneously create insecurities. And because of that, security and insecurity, it seems to me, are transitive, relational, distributive phenomena. Insecurity is something I would say that is a bit like famine, as an extreme example, that we do to one another. I would advocate, and I'm indebted here to other people working within this type of area that have adopted similar approaches. I would advocate a contextualized political ecology analysis and approach to understanding water problems, water security, water justice problems, and part of that involves moving beyond water, understanding water and water issues specifically in broader social and political contexts. I think, and I'm indebted here to the water justice literature, to the justice and water justice literatures, I think that questions of recognition and participation and non-recognition and non-participation are crucial. They're really important contributory factors to water insecurity. And then just three more brief points that I want to make. One here is that I think the water security literature, with its focus that's much more on the national scale, national comparative scale, I think there's problems with that. But I think that's something that water justice researchers don't do enough. I think that's something that water justice researchers could learn from the water security research a bit, to pay a little bit more attention to national differences in patterns of water injustice and water insecurity. I also think that within both literatures, there isn't probably quite enough attention to how water insecurities are historically layered. And I'll provide some illustration of that, of what I mean by that in a few minutes. And then finally, and I've sort of made this point before, I think there could be a bit more sensitivity to issues which are underexplored across both approaches. And the three issues that I'm going to come on and say something about are all meant to be illustrative of that. Let me go on to these three areas that I want to talk about, which are highlighted in red here. Three key water security, and one might say water justice issues: the global virtual water trade, water frontiers, and the impacts of war on water. Let me say something about the global virtual water trade first. So many of you will, I imagine, be familiar with the idea of virtual water. And for those of you who are not familiar with the idea, virtual water is water which is being used in the production of a commodity. Agricultural commodities, also industrial commodities, which are then in virtual water trade traded. So when water is used in production of a crop and that crop is then exported, virtual water people talk about that as being an export or an import of virtual water. So the global virtual water trade, I mean, virtual water is normally talked about, and this is the context in which it was developed and taken up, as an adaptation to scarcity. So society, states, actors can and should adapt to not having enough water. Countries which, where putting it simply, which have relatively limited water resources, can and should adapt to this by importing more virtual water, using less of their water supplies for the production of export commodities, especially agricultural export economies. And this idea was first developed in relation to the Middle East, was taken up by all kinds of international organizations, including the World Bank, as a sort of liberal, or if you like, neoliberal way of responding to and addressing water scarcities. My own approach and understanding to virtual water, and we set this out in the book, is that actually the global virtual water trade doesn't follow a logic of scarcity above all, but is an instance of what political ecologists would call unequal ecological exchange, in which virtual water, doesn't flow towards scarce regions on aggregate, but flows towards money. Among our cases, so you see this in the overall the global map illustrated there, where one sees amongst other things that Europe is a import importer of virtual water. Just to give one very specific example of that, the UK's virtual water footprint is, according to some analyses, around 6 times that of the amount of water which is consumed domestically. So water flows uphill towards money. And our cases actually, that we go through in the book, they exemplify this as well. Israel and Cyprus, amongst our cases, are major importers of virtual water, managing their water problems in large parts through importing large volumes of food and other commodities that they therefore don't need to use that water for the production of. On the other hand, Sudan and Syria are major exporters of virtual water. Now, what's this got to do with water security? What's it got to do with water justice? Well, actually, that's an important question, and exactly what the boundaries of that are a little bit. I think they're open for debate, but I think it clearly becomes an issue when one has the equivalent of what I illustrate with a quote from Marx at the bottom, when he was talking about a pattern that developed in the relations between Britain, England, and Ireland, in which under British or English colonial rule, England indirectly exported the soil of Ireland without even allowing its cultivators the means for replacing the constituents of the exhausted soil, robbing the soil and robbing the worker. And I think one does see this pattern playing out in large parts of the global south, in which water resource depletion, degradation, and associated insecurity are occurring for commodity exports. One very clearly sees it in the 2 cases which we explore in relation to this in our book, Sudan and Syria. In Syria, most notably, pre-civil war, Syria had developed a strong push towards crop exports, in which this was leading to very unsustainable sort of depletion of groundwater resources in particular, and in which rural agrarian socioeconomic crisis developed pre-civil war as a result, within the context of and to enable crop exports. To my mind, this is a water justice issue and a water security issue within those contexts and globally. Let me move on to say something about water frontiers from this. Now, the concept of water frontiers isn't one that you won't find generally within literature and discussions of water issues. We have a chapter on it and developed this as a concept drawing upon the quite large existing literature on resource frontiers or commodity frontiers. Frontiers, as we understand them, are spaces of outward expansion and incorporation by existing power centers within, it can be on an international scale, but very often, and within the cases that we look at a sort of domestic social level. So there's spaces of outward expansion and incorporation where, and this brings in the water frontiers, where the capture, development and control of water resources is a key objective. Now, water frontiers, and this is typical of frontiers more broadly, they're typically either in fact or at the level of imagination, spaces of environmental and water resource abundance, where that abundance, be it real or imagined, or having developed, emerged as a result of technological or other economic changes, that's the central reason these frontiers became sites for gold rushes and targets of expansion and incorporation. But often at the same time, these areas are, for historical reasons, home to indigenous and minority groups on different scales. And the combination of these things, combined with their geographical location, typically a long way from sort of centers of state power, so often towards the geographical periphery of national territories. The combination of those things typically means that water frontiers become sites of extreme levels of water resource appropriation, inequality, degradation, conflict, and insecurity. And we see this, and in our book, we chart this in relation to a number of different cases. We explore it in relation to northeast Syria. We explore it in relation to Sahelian Sudan, the area of South Kordofan, and also Darfur. In relation to the Lake Chad region, in particular northeast Nigeria, and Palestine, especially the West Bank. Gaza we also consider to be a frontier, but of a rather slightly different, more enclave type character. In each of which we argue that there are strong frontier dynamics of the type that I've just tried to summarize here. So just to illustrate, in relation to northeast Syria, what one got in the period from the 1980s and 1990s was a recognition that areas in the northeast Syria, including areas with relatively low rainfall, nonetheless had quite abundant groundwater resources, which could be tapped for monocultural wheat development. This was pushed by the Syrian state, by the Ba'athist state in Syria, was supported by and enabled by cheap grants for all kinds of things, but especially for fertilizers and for fuel. And it was also supported partly for political reasons as part of a project of Arabizing the northeast of Syria within the context of a predominantly Kurdish region. The consequence of this was extremely rapid water resource degradation, groundwater depletion within northeast Syria, and in which within 15 years or so, the model of groundwater dependent and cheap input dependent development quickly collapsed, leading to, in the period just before the civil war, quite large outmigration from rural areas of northeast Syria. So that's water frontiers. Let me then just come on briefly to my third element that I think it doesn't feature enough within water security or water justice literatures, perhaps surprisingly. And this is the question of the impacts of war on water. Now, I just here in this slide list some of the ways in which war is crucial to water security and water justice, from the direct damage to and destruction of water supply and sanitation infrastructures, the equivalent damage and destruction of sources of energy, which are crucial for managing and supplying water, shortages of material, equipment, and capital for the maintenance of water systems, the both short and longer term impacts on governance and institutions, the creation of new geographies of water demand as a result of fighting in the short term, and displacement, especially if that displacement becomes semi-permanent. All the various knock-on consequences of fighting, of war, for instance, for agricultural production, or for health, or other areas. And impacts of various other types that I won't go into too much, apart from to say that these impacts, there are many different impacts. They're typically cumulative, coming on top of one another, and have often long-lasting implications, long-lasting consequences as a result, and that we find powerful evidence of them across all of our cases. So across all of the cases that we analyze, we have our chapter on the impacts of war on water. We find the evidence of the extremely grave evidence of impacts of war on water, to be honest, far outweighs the evidence in relation to some of the other themes that we look at, yet is peculiarly understudied within literature on water politics broadly. It's quite shocking in some ways how little research there has been on the impacts of war on water. Now, let me, in the final few minutes, come towards saying something about Gaza, because as I said before, I think it's a case that, given what's happening at the moment, has been happening for the last 3 or 4 months, I couldn't not talk about Gaza to a degree. So let me close. I'll make a few concluding remarks, but for the remainder of the time, I'm going to spend talking about Gaza. What I want to show you first of all, actually, though, is a slide which isn't Gaza. This is an image of the Languedoc region in southern France. And you might think, with good reason, why am I showing you this this image? And the reason is that what I'm going to do in my comments for a few minutes is to try and place Gaza's water insecurity and water injustice crisis in context. And that involves going back a little bit historically. And I want to take you back historically to when Napoleon Bonaparte passed through Gaza in a trek. He'd gone through the Sinai Desert and arrived in Gaza. And this is what he wrote to one of his generals. "We've crossed 70 leagues of desert, a very tiring business," he said. "Brackish water, often none at all in the Sinai. But of Gaza," he said, he described it as having lemon bushes, olive groves, and broken ground that are just like the scenery of the Languedoc. And its climate, he added, it might be that of Paris. I think that context is that the having some understanding and context for what Gaza was like in previous decades and centuries is crucial. Just to illustrate that I'm not just completely making this up, and also to make sure that I provide image of Gaza. This is a photo of from Gaza district from I think it's dated 1898. And I'm not going to focus too much on particular issues of the present, but the question which concerns me is how we get from that one state of affairs, to here, and to here, and to a situation which in Gaza at the moment, which is catastrophic in general terms and in relation to water specifically. Catastrophic in relation to water, in terms of the destruction, the degradation of its groundwater resources through salinization and pollution, in terms of the very limited access to water supplies, in terms of the destruction of water and sanitation infrastructure, and in terms of the health impacts of that right now, and which will no doubt go forward as well. How should we understand this? I need to work out how I'm doing this bit here. There we go. How should we understand this? So I want to give you a number of different, I think 7 or 8 sort of layers that I think we need to think through when thinking about water insecurity and injustice in Gaza. And I have to start by going right back. I find this one has to have an understanding that goes a long way back, and to questions of race. I'm not going to detain us a long time on this, but personally I find this quote which you find in Herzl's diary of when he went to visit Joseph Chamberlain, the British colonial secretary, and to talk about finding a place for the Zionist movement to establish a national home. He was actually asking about setting up a national home in Cyprus. And Chamberlain's response to Herzl was that Herzl should go find a spot in the English possessions where there were no white people as yet. Fast forward to the second layer through which I think we need to understand Gaza's water situation. We need to come to the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948-9, in which prior to 1948, the majority of British mandates cultivated land was Palestinian owned, and Palestinian and Jews were roughly equal users of Palestine's water resources. 1948-9, though, saw the expulsion of around just over 750,000 Palestinians, with attendant loss of water access by those Palestinians. I should add to this, and this links with the point about recognition, that Palestinian prior use rights to those waters are typically not recognized at all. Gaza's population quadrupled, and this is the fundamental root of its water crisis. This, for those of you who are not familiar, is where Gaza's refugees came from nearly 200 villages, mostly in southern central Palestine, but some going right towards the north as well. Fast forward, especially to post-1967, Israel occupied the Gaza Strip from 1967, and what one sees in the period from 1967 onwards is processes of de-development, enclavement, and crucially, the denial of a water supply hinterland. I'll just give you one broader illustration of this. This is Gaza's railway. Gaza was connected, had a railway line going through it that connected down to the Sinai and right the way up to Haifa and Jerusalem. To the top right, you see Gaza's railway station. It was demolished after Israel took control of the Gaza Strip and dismantled, and bits of it used to construct, amongst other things, the Bar-Lev line as a defense against Egypt. What does this have to do with water? Well, there's a broader pattern of enclavement, isolation of Gaza in relation to water. The most important thing that you need to know about Gaza's water situation is that Israel has developed over the course of the last 5-6 decades a very integrated national water network, which ships water all over the place to the things that they think are needed for national purposes. And the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, is very integrated into Israel's national water network. Gaza, by contrast, isn't. Gaza is not integrated into Israel's national water network, importing only a tiny amount. This is pre the current war, importing only a tiny amount from Israel's national water system. The point of this illustration here, which comes an illustration first developed by my late colleague and friend Clemens Messerschmitt, is to draw an analogy between Gaza and Manhattan. This is the two of them together by scale with where Gaza's water could come from if it was linked in with Israel's national water network, together with where Manhattan gets its water from the Catskill Mountains and from the Hudson River. And the point is this, that pretty much that Manhattan, like pretty much every major built-up area in the world, has to rely on having a water supply hinterland. And if it doesn't, it will face water crisis. Manhattan would face water crisis if it had to make do with getting its water pretty much exclusively internally. And Gaza does likewise. What else? I need to wrap up quite shortly, so just a few more minutes. I'll just rattle through this quickly. Gaza was pretty much excluded from peace process cross-border cooperation mechanisms in relation to water. These mechanisms were set up, they were problematic, but they were set up in relation to the West Bank. Gaza, the territory which more needed help in relation to its water issues, was excluded from them. Again, an issue to do with recognition and participation. Since 2007, Israel and the international community established a blockade on Gaza, which has had huge implications in terms of its water infrastructures and water supply. That including a very sort of techno-managerially oriented Gaza reconstruction mechanism, which has included all the failings really of a depoliticized water security approach. And then, of course, wars. Israeli offensives, of which it's important to recognise that the current one, though far more extreme, is by no means the first, and the impacts of these previous Israeli offensives is discussed in some detail in our book. Simultaneous, I should add, with not from the right beginning of this, but since over the last 15 years, the development of a situation within Israel where Israel has a surplus of water. Layered water insecurity and injustice within Gaza. I realise I've rushed through an awful lot here. Let me just make some concluding remarks. Now, Gaza is clearly an extreme case, and it's exceptional in some degrees. It's exceptional, for instance, in the intensity of the violence that's been meted on Gaza since October. But in other respects, it's not exceptional and unique. And one of the points that we try to make in the book is that there are many overlapping and comparative points between the cases. Quite apart from that, I think it's important to recognise that we're at a time in which there is a resurgence of major war, and in which there is a deepening disregard for humanitarian norms and the laws of war, with obvious implications for water security. And so in relation to the point about the impacts of war on water, for instance, it seems to me that any meaningful water security agenda, or water justice agenda for that matter, needs to engage with this question of war, and needs, frankly, to be anti-militarist and anti-war. In terms of the conceptual argument that I'd make and that I'm making, ultimately, it doesn't matter whether we speak of water security or water justice, or water insecurity or water injustice. I think what's more important is what we do with those terms, what those terms and framings allow us to do. But it's striking, and for me it's worrying, that most water security research is so apolitical. And I think water justice research could do more to challenge that, to step up to the mark on that. And I also think that water justice research needs a somewhat wider and even more political understanding than it has at present of the causes of contemporary water insecurities and injustices. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Selby. This was an absolutely amazing lecture and a great opener to the series. It's been a huge pleasure to listen in, and we have a couple of questions to you posted in the chat. I see also a raised hand. Perhaps if I could ask the given participant to write the question in the chat, that would be the preferred option here. So one question that got posted just now is actually about the concept of water wars, which is very much a highly discussed topic in academia and also grey literature. And the question asks, can we still say that future water wars intended as formal military confrontation between different states are a myth? Or there are new reasons to reconsider this future possibility? And considering the slide on the war on water, perhaps you have some insights that you could share with us.
Sure, thank you. Thanks ever so much for the question. So yes, I believe that water wars are a myth, that the evidence for them historically is very weak. And I think that there's good reasons, there are lots of good reasons to think that that pattern is not likely to change anytime soon. I think there's plentiful evidence, and lots of people have argued and shown that the historical evidence in relation to water wars is quite weak, and lots of cases that have been suggested as being, was that a water war? The claims are overstated. But the bigger issue, if you like, is the going forward and the future question. And to my mind, the key issue in terms of thinking about the future question is it involves thinking about how water figures within the interests, in relation to the interests and motivations of the powerful actors who engage or might engage in war and fighting. And I would argue that even within contexts where water resources are being degraded or are becoming more scarce, and in many contexts where that itself is overstated, but that's a different issue, that in contexts even where water resources are being degraded and are becoming scarce, that water is not, as a result of that, rising up political agendas, if you like, as to be so important as to motivate war. And to the contrary, in many regards, water has gone through a period of becoming less important in economic and political terms. We set this out in some detail in the second chapter of the book. So I mean, I'd strongly recommend for those interested to have a look at the arguments that we make there. What I will say as a final point on this issue is that one of the things which I find really striking is that there remains lots which is written on this question: is water causing war, or will water cause war, or in relation to climate, is climate change going to cause war, and so on. And I find it frankly quite bizarre and quite shocking that so much is written on this speculative question, which I think is misguided, but so little academic research is conducted on the question of the impacts of war on water and water-related vulnerabilities. And I think we really need to rethink our priorities, and there needs to be a shift in the balance of where work is done on this question of what the intersection between war and water is.
Thank you so much for the answer. Very exhaustive and also very interesting. So there's, I'm sure, several follow-up questions or, opportunities to discuss further. I see another interesting question. It's about transboundary waters. And it is from Dr. Sufia, who is asking, I would like to know how justice can be ensured in terms of sharing the transboundary water sharing, or transboundary waters, where there are no international binding instruments available. The example given is Bangladesh, that is sharing 54 transboundary rivers with India. And as India is the upstream country, there's only one treaty over the Ganges River, and Bangladesh suffers severe water shortage. And how can a country like Bangladesh, in this case, pledge for water justice to the international community?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and I don't have a particular answer about the way in which that can and should be done. A lot of the answer obviously is context specific within specific contexts and will vary from one context to another. I think the main thing that I will want to say in response to this is that, and this to link it with the broad theme of my comments, is that there is a tendency amongst international actors, international mediators, development organizations, water organizations, when they're engaging with these issues of transboundary inequalities and injustices, or transboundary disputes over water, there is an unfortunate tendency to approach them in an apolitical way. And that tendency has not gone away. And actually, within the context of an era where there's an understandable concern with climate change, the climate change has become one of the main framings around which often these things are addressed. These issues, water security, water inequality, transboundary riparian issues are addressed, and can lead to very technical framings as well. I think in broad terms, there should be no alternative but to approach them as political questions and not hide away from the politics. if you hide away from the politics in engaging with these issues, either as development actors or as mediators, one will end up buttressing the interest and supporting the interests of the most powerful. So I think, as in general terms, the thing I would say is one needs to approach these in a political way and re-politicize the discourse and the thinking and the debate around them, and not try, for instance, well, let's try to have cooperation around a project in relation to climate change on this issue, where that may and will often not be the core issue.
Thank you so much. Speaking of power and stronger actors, there are two questions that touch upon this theme. So one question asks about virtual water trade, and it's a question whether you would argue that virtual water trade disproportionately benefits countries in the global north at the expense of the global south. And perhaps linked to it, there's also a question about whether we can perceive certain invasions as driven by the need of water resources. So specifically, one participant is asking whether Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories can be seen as something driven for water resources. So if you were to look at those power imbalances, what would be your take on virtual water, on perhaps increasing someone's engagement at the expense of the other?
So I think it's pretty clear that the virtual water trade benefits on aggregates the global north more than the global south. There are of course differences on a country by country basis. But if you look at the slide that I showed on the virtual water trade, if you can see that again now, if you look at the graph on the right side, what that shows is the net virtual water trade from a study by Lenzen and colleagues of scarce water, that is, of water which has been depleted. And very clearly, you see that you have actors from the countries from the global north, which are importing water being depleted by states in the global south. So I think that pattern is reasonably clear at a global scale. Of course, there are differences on a country by country basis. In relation to your question about water in Israel-Palestine, I don't think that fundamentally Israel's invasion and occupation of the West Bank and Gaza was driven by concerns to do with water. I think the evidence for that is pretty weak. One can certainly argue that after Israel took occupation of the West Bank in 1967, they implemented policies in order to fit their hydro water supply interests as they saw them, and they took advantage of it, decided to take advantage of it by restricting Palestinian water supply in the West Bank so that the water from it would flow through to Israel. One can also make a case that some settlement policies were in part informed by those hydropolitical questions. Let's have the settlements in areas which we think are important recharge areas. But overall, I think the evidence is pretty weak, and that fits with more broadly what I said about water wars. I think it's a mistake to imagine that water is so important politically or economically that states are strongly motivated to engage in invasions because of it. Water is hugely important at a humanitarian level and in terms of individuals and groups' water insecurity, but not nearly to the same degree in relation to state and elite power.
Thank you so much. And perhaps on the finishing note, someone is asking whether we see already justice playing a stronger role in water resource planning. So is there research that is covering this topic that gives us examples where justice indeed is one of the driving elements when it comes to water resource management and water resource planning?
I'm sure the answer to that is yes. I'm hoping that other speakers might speak to that a little bit more in future lectures. I'm not sure I've got a very good answer to that. I think it's quite context specific situation. But I mean, maybe the other thing that I should say on this is that in relation to the overall theme of what I've been saying, is that the water justice research, has had a lot less policy traction than water security thinking. Water justice research is much stronger at an academic level, and also at within some contexts at a civil society, NGO, grassroots organizing level, than in terms of how it's been incorporated within international policy and development thinking, for instance. So I think there's I'm sure there are positives to say, but I think there's a lot more that could be done in that direction.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Selby. It's been a great honor to have you here and have you as the opener speaker for our webinar series. I would like to also thank all the participants for the amazing questions. Sadly, we didn't have enough time to answer them all, but there were a couple great ones. And I wanted to also kindly remind about the upcoming lecture, so the continuation of the series, and we will be meeting again next week on Wednesday at 4 p.m. again with Dr. Nicolas Galli, who will be talking about water security perspectives, unveiling certain water conflict complexities. So I hope to see you all there. Once again, thank you so much, Professor Selby. Thank you so much, Dr. Delangelo. And we hope to see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulina. Thank you, everybody.